Mark Twain Selected Works. The Private History of a Campaign That Failed. Part 3. We struck down the lane, then across some rocky pasture land which offered good advantages for stumbling. Consequently, we were down in the mud most of the time, and every time a man went down, he blackguarded the war and everybody connected with it, and gave himself the master dose of all for being so foolish as to go into it. At last we reached the wooded mouth of a ravine, and there we huddled ourselves under the streaming trees and sent the Negro back home. It was a dismal and heartbreaking time. We were like to be drowned with the rain, deafened with the howling wind and the booming thunder, and blinded by the lightning. It was indeed a wild night. The drenching we were getting was misery enough, but a deeper misery still was the reflection that the altar might end us before we were a day older. A death of this shameful sort had not occurred to us as being among the possibilities of war. It took the romance all out of the campaign and turned our dreams of glory into a repulsive nightmare. As for doubting that so barbarous an order had been given, not one of us did that. The long night wore itself out at last, and then the Negro came to us with the news that the alarm had manifestly been a false one, and that breakfast would soon be ready. Straightway we were light-hearted again, and the world was bright and full of life, as full of hope and promise as ever. For we were young then. How long ago that was! 24 years. The mongrel child of philology named the night's refuge Camp Devastation, and though Soul objected, the Masons gave us a Missouri country breakfast in Missouri in abundance, and we needed it. Hot biscuits, hot wheat bread, prettily crossed in a lattice pattern on top, hot corn pone, fried chicken, bacon, coffee, eggs, milk, buttermilk, etc. And the world may be confidently challenged to furnish the equal of such a breakfast as it is cooked in the South. We stayed several days at Mason's, and after all these years, the memory of the stillness and dullness and lifelessness of that slumberous farmhouse still oppresses my spirit, as with the sense of the presence of death and mourning. There was nothing to do, nothing to think about. There was no interest in life. The male part of the household were away in the fields all day. The women were busy and out of our sight. There was no sound but the plaintive wailing of a spinning wheel forever moaning out from some distant room. A most lonesome sound in nature, a sound steeped and sodden with homesickness and the emptiness of life. The family went to bed about dark every night, and as we were not invited to intrude any new customs, we naturally followed theirs. Those nights were 100 years long to youths accustomed to being up till 12. We lay awake and miserable till that hour, and grew old and decrepit, waiting through the still eternities for the clock strikes. This was no place for town boys, so at last it was with something very like joy that we received word that the enemy were on our track again. With a new birth of the old warrior spirit, we sprang to our places in line of battle and fell back on Camp Rawls. Captain Lyman had taken a hint from Mason's talk, and he now gave orders that our camp should be guarded from surprise by the posting of pickets. I was ordered to place a picket at the forks of the road in Hyde's Prairie. Night shut down black and threatening. I told Sergeant Bowers to go out to that place and stay till midnight, and just as I was expecting, he said he wouldn't do it. I tried to get others to go, but all refused. Some excused themselves on account of the weather, but the rest were frank enough to say they wouldn't go in any kind of weather. This kind of thing sounds odd now and impossible, but there was no surprise in it at the time. On the contrary, it seemed a perfectly natural thing to do. There were scores of little camps scattered over Missouri where the same thing was happening. These camps were composed of young men who had been born and reared to a sturdy independence and who did not know what it meant to be ordered around by Tom, Dick, and Harry, who they had known familiarly all their lives in the village or the farm. It is quite within probabilities that this same thing was happening all over the South. James Redpath recognized the justice of this assumption and furnished the following instance in support of it. During a short stay in East Tennessee, he was in a citizen colonel's tent one day talking, when a big private appeared at the door and, without salute or other circumlocution, said to the colonel, "Say, Jim, I'm a-going home for a few days." "What for?" "Well, I hain't been there for a right smart while, and I'd like to see how things is coming on." "How long you going to be gone?" "About 2 weeks." "Well, don't be gone longer than that, and get back sooner if you can." That was all, and the citizen officer resumed his conversation where the private had broken it off. This was in the first months of the war, of course. The camps in our part of Missouri were under Brigadier General Thomas H. Harris. He was a townsman of ours, a first-rate fellow and well-liked, but we had all familiarly known him as the sole and modest salaried operator in the telegraph office, where he had to send about 1 dispatch a week in ordinary times and 2 when there was a rush of business. Consequently, when he appeared in our midst one day on the wing and delivered in a military command of some sort in a large military fashion, nobody was surprised at the response which he got from the assembled soldiery. "Oh, now, what'll you take to don't, Tom Harris?" It was quite the natural thing. One might justly imagine that we were hopeless material for the war, and so we seemed in our ignorant state. But there were those among us who afterward learned the grim trade, learned to obey like machines, became valuable soldiers, fought all through the war, and came out at the end with excellent records. One of the very boys who refused to go out on picket duty that night and called me an ass for thinking he would expose himself to danger in such a foolhardy way had become distinguished for intrepidity before he was a year older. I did secure my picket that night, not by authority, but by diplomacy. I got Bowers to go by agreeing to exchange ranks with him for the time being and go along and stand the watch with him as his subordinate. We stayed out there a couple of dreary hours in the pitchy darkness and the rain, with nothing to modify the dreariness but Bowers's monotonous growling at the war and the weather. Then we began to nod and presently found it next to impossible to stay in the saddle. So we gave up the tedious job and went back to the camp without interruption or objection from anybody, and the enemy could have done the same, for there were no sentries. Everybody was asleep. At midnight there was nobody to send out another picket, so none was sent. We never tried to establish a watch at night again, as far as I remember, but we generally kept the picket out in the daytime. In that camp, the whole command slept on the corn in the big corn crib, and there was usually a general row before morning, for the place was full of rats, and they would scramble over the boys' bodies and faces, annoying and irritating everybody. And now and then they would bite someone's toe, and the person who owned the toe would start up and magnify his English and begin to throw corn in the dark. The ears were half as heavy as bricks, and when they struck, they hurt. The person struck would respond, and inside of 5 minutes every man would be locked in a death grip with his neighbor. There was a grievous deal of bloodshed in the corn crib, but this was all that was spilt while I was in the war. No, that is not quite true, but for one circumstance it would have been all. Our scares were frequent. Every few days rumors would come that the enemy were approaching. In these cases we always fell back on some other camp of ours. We never stayed where we were, but the rumors always turned out to be false, so at last we even began to grow indifferent to them. One night a Negro was sent to our corn crib with the same old warning the enemy was hovering in our neighborhood. We all said, "Let him hover." We resolved to stay still and be comfortable. It was a fine, warlike resolution, and no doubt we all felt the stir of it in our veins for a moment. We had been having a very jolly time that was full of horseplay and schoolboy hilarity, but that cooled down, and presently the fast waning fire of forced jokes and forced laughs died out altogether, and the company became silent and nervous, and soon uneasy, worried, and apprehensive. We had said we would stay, and we were committed. We could have been persuaded to go, but there was nobody brave enough to suggest it. An almost noiseless movement began in the dark by a general but unvoiced impulse. When the movement was completed, each man knew that he was not the only person who had crept to the front wall and had his eye at a crack between the logs. No, we were all there with our hearts in our throats and staring out towards the sugar troughs where the forest footpath came through. It was late, and there was a deep, woodsy stillness everywhere. There was a veiled moonlight which was only just strong enough to enable us to mark the general shape of objects. Presently a muffled sound caught our ears, and we recognized the hoof beats of a horse or horses, and right away a figure appeared in the forest path. It could have been made of smoke, its mass had such a little sharpness of outline. It was a man on horseback, and it seemed to me that there were others behind him. I got a hold of a gun in the dark and pushed it through a crack between the logs, hardly knowing what I was doing. I was so dazed with fright. Somebody said, "Fire!" I pulled the trigger. I seemed to see 100 flashes and 100 reports, and I saw the man fall down out of the saddle. My first feeling was of surprised gratification. My first impulse was an apprentice sportsman's impulse to run and pick up his game. Somebody said, hardly audibly, "Good, we got him. Wait for the rest." But the rest did not come. There was not a sound, not the whisper of a leaf, just the perfect stillness, an uncanny kind of stillness which was all the more uncanny on account of the damp, earthy, late-night smells now rising and pervading it. Then, wondering, we crept out stealthily and approached the man. When we got to him, the moon revealed him distinctly. He was lying on his back with his arms abroad, his mouth was open, and his chest was heaving with long gasps, and his white shirt front was splashed with blood. The thought shot through me that I was a murderer, that I had killed a man who had never done me any harm. That was the coldest sensation that ever went through my marrow. I was down by him in a moment, helplessly stroking his forehead, and I would have given anything then, my own life freely, to make him again what he had been 5 minutes before. And all the boys seemed to be feeling the same way. They hung over him full of pity and interest, and tried all they could to help him, and said all sorts of regretful things. They had forgotten all about the enemy. They thought only of this one forlorn unit of the foe. Once my imagination persuaded me that the dying man gave me a reproachful look out of the shadow of his eyes, and it seemed to me that I could rather that he had stabbed me than he had done that. He muttered and mumbled like a dreamer in his sleep about his wife and his child, and I thought with a new despair, this thing that I have done does not end with him. It falls upon them too, and they never did me any harm any more than he. In a little while the man was dead. He was killed in war, killed in fair and legitimate war, killed in battles, as you may say, and yet he was as sincerely mourned by the opposing force as if he had been their brother. The boys stood there a half-hour sorrowing over him and recalling the details of the tragedy and wondering who he might be and if he was a spy, and saying if they had to do it over again they would not hurt him unless he attacked them first. It soon turned out that mine was not the only shot fired. There were 5 others. A division of the guilt, which was a great relief to me, since it in some degree lightened and diminished the burden I was carrying. There were 6 shots fired at once, but I was not in my right mind at the time, and my heated imagination had magnified my one shot into a volley.